Days with them up there. Just it's like a Garden of Eden. You put your hand up and there's a fig. You put your hand up and there's a jujube. Have you ever had a jujube?
No, what is that?
They're delicious. Well, when you pick them right off the tree, they're like apples. They taste a little bit like apples. But if you let them ripen, they turn into a kind of a raisin, and it's very sweet.
Get somebody else to be admitted, Mary.
So we might want to pass out the Bibles this morning. Thank you.
Good.
Tell me when it's done.
It's recording.
Oh, okay. So it's so good to be back here in person. So good to be back here in person with my favorite group in the Dayton area. Both you here in person and people online. Thank you for coming back. But I also feel a little bit sad that today is the last day
So are we.
in our journey through Romans, Paul's last and greatest letter. But I will come back in the future if you ask me. And we've already talked about topics for future classes over in the winter or the spring. As we have discovered, Paul dreamed, he envisioned the possibility of peace with God and reconciliation between peoples. And his great letter to the Romans was intended as a testament, right? Written for the people at Rome, but also, I think, for Christians elsewhere. A copy of Romans, it appears, was taken back to Ephesus, to the place that had been the center of Paul's mission for 15 years. So Romans is Paul's final vision of the future of the human community. Paul believed, he hoped, that on the basis of the self-giving love, the sacrificial love of Jesus of Nazareth, that a right life might be possible. A life lived on the basis of trust in God. And in particular, Paul was concerned that relations between Jewish followers of Jesus and Gentile, Greek, Roman, Syrian, Egyptian, Paul was concerned that differences over custom, food, obedience to the Mosaic law, Paul was concerned that this might endanger the community of reconciliation that he tried so hard to bring about. But Paul was not content simply to dream or to vision. As we will see today, when we turn our attention to Romans 12:1 to 15:13, Paul was determined to put that vision into practice in community. Paul was a community founder, right? All over the Mediterranean. He established little cells of a new kind of humanity. He baptized people underneath the formula, in Christ. There is no longer what? Jew or Greek. So the hostility between people should be dissolved. Paul told the Corinthians at one point that we have been given a ministry of reconciliation. And the Greek word that we translate reconciliation, katalage. Can you say that with me? Katalage. It actually means other making, other becoming. So Paul was determined that in these little communities, a Greek person might become something different, something other to a Jew than an object of contempt. And that a Jew might become something other, something different to a Greek than an object of fear and dread. Or the events of the last 10 days since the 7th of October, they reinforce how much we need Paul's vision, how much we need to commit ourselves to it, to try to live it out in the communities of which we are a part, like this wonderful one here at Epiphany. Now, in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, Paul turns his attention, having completed the grand vision, he now turns to the kind of life that this vision calls for in community. Look at the first verse. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters. The Greek verb that is translated appeal is the verb parakaleo. Can you say that with me? Parakaleo. You know what it literally means? To call alongside. So Paul does not place himself above the Roman Christ followers, preaching down at them. He calls them alongside him. The posture, I think, is significant, right? It establishes horizontal solidarity with them. When you have your brother or sister alongside you, you can do what? Put your arm around them, slap them on the wrist, if it has to be. But the posture, I think, is important. I call you alongside, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God. Now, this is a really important word. In Greek, it's the word oiktirmoi. There's the plural, oiktirmoi. Can you say that with me? Yeah, it's the tender mercies of God. Frequently in the Old Testament, it is identical with the word charis, which means what? Grace. Wow. How much we need this. Mercy. Right? Not vengeance. Not settling a score. Not an eye for an eye. The Christian life, as Paul understands it, is an extension of God's mercy. God's mercy toward us in the loving death of Christ, that is what we are to be toward others. Merciful. Merciful. Offering grace, offering mercy. I call you alongside, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the oiktirmoi, the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, the Greek verb that's translated here to present is a very interesting verb. It is the verb parhistein. And it is used at the temple when a person brings a sacrifice and presents it to the priest. So our life, like the life of Jesus, is to be what? Self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice out of the extension of God's mercy. Oh, this is so countercultural. You know, today we're being told that there can only be peace through what? Conquest, victory, suppression. But what Paul understands is that it is actually the presentation of a life in an act of self-giving, sacrifice. Now, Paul says we are to present our bodies. The Greek word that Paul uses, it's an important word in Paul's letters, soma. And it does not, in Paul, designate merely the physical body, the flesh. Soma is a larger concept for Paul. It is the whole person, the totality of a person's life in the world. Now, I don't see any evidence here that Paul is arguing for asceticism, right? The practice of self-denial, restricting your physical pleasures or your diet. That's a misinterpretation. Paul is saying that everything that you are in your embodied existence in the world should be presented as a sacrifice, extending God's mercy, God's grace to others. Now, it is described here as a living sacrifice. We need to know the background of this. There were two kinds of sacrifices at ancient temple. The first one we're familiar with, a goat or a lamb, a dove, was presented to the priest, and the priest did what? Yeah, and cut the throat and collected the blood in a paten, a little dish, and then cast it on the altar. That's a bloody sacrifice. By contrast, there were living sacrifices. What was this? Does anyone know? An animal, a sheep, or a goat might be brought to the temple and given to the priest, and instead of taking the life of the animal, the priest kept it for milk and for clothing and for whatever else the wonderful sacrifice produced. It lived in the temple compound. That's Paul's idea. So with our whole selves, our incarnated selves in this world, we are to view our lives as a living sacrifice. Now, notice that what Paul has just abolished here is the boundary between the cult, right? What happens at the temple, the ritual, which is a separate place from the rest of the cyculum, the rest of the world. That boundary is gone now. In other words, according to Paul, and I thought Luther understood this perfectly well, and Calvin, the life of a Christian is a form of worship, or should be. It should be worship. It's not as if we come to the church for an hour and worship here, and then what? Go out in the world and curse our neighbor and take advantage of everyone that we can and pay back people. I know it's so difficult to avoid that tendency. I get these telephone calls, at least 5 a day, offering me something that I don't need or want. And I'm so tempted, to answer them the way that my older son did with his strange little sense of humor. He answered them by offering them toilet paper. I have to resist the temptation to do that, right? So, no, the life of a Christian in the world should be an extension of mercy. It's a continual act of worship. And Paul says that this is our spiritual worship. This concept of spiritual worship, Paul was not the only one that had that idea in the first century. In fact, it was widespread among the Stoics and among Hellenistic Jews. The idea that true worship does not consist in the sacrifice of an animal's life at the temple, but true worship is spiritual. And so, for example, Stoics believed that moral living according to virtue, was the truest kind of worship. And in the Corpus Hermeticum, a text that blends together Greek and Jewish ideas, the first tractate says, "Receive, O God, pure spiritual sacrifices from a soul and a heart offered to you, the inexpressible, ineffable, called in silence." Beautiful, isn't it? Corpus Hermeticum, the great hymn at the end of the collection, number 13, expressly designates worship as logike, reasonable, spiritual, rational. That's the only kind of acceptable sacrifice. And then this idea moves over into Hellenistic Judaism, the so-called Testament of Levi, one of the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, deathbed speeches that the patriarchs gave to their sons and daughters assembled around them. The Testament of Levi says in the 3rd chapter, bearing to the Lord a sweet fragrance, a reasonable sacrifice, logike thusia, the same words used by Paul, and it's the same in the Odes of Solomon, another Hellenistic Jewish text. Solomon says, I am a priest of the Lord, and I serve the Lord in priestly fashion by offering the Lord spiritual sacrifice. So Paul participates in this transformation of cult at the temple into a spiritual and reasonable form of dedication to God. What is different, however, Mary, in Paul, what distinguishes Paul from the Stoics aimed at the virtue of the individual wise man who realized what was truly important, who made himself invulnerable to passions. That was spiritual worship for the Stoics, a very individual thing. But as we will see in the next few verses, for Paul, this goal of a living sacrifice through spiritual worship of God is something that only occurs in community. It is conditioned by, empowered by, it is realized in a community. So Paul goes on to say, and this is the final large principle that he is erecting over the door of communal practice. Paul says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds. Wow. So the life of a Christ follower consists not in adjusting to, accommodating to, conforming to the principles of the world. Yeah. It's a nonconformist way of life. Don't be conformed. Don't be made similar to those people who are chasing after all of the things that are being put out there for us to buy and to achieve. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed. And here's the word Paul uses, by the anagnosis. Wow. Can you say that with me? Anagnosis. This is the only place in the New Testament that the word occurs. In fact, according to Walter Bauer's Greek-English lexicon, this word is not found outside of Christian literature. In other words, literature influenced by Romans. You see the prefix preposition, ana, which means again, kenosis, made new again. What we need is a renewal. We need a rebirth, a renewal, a rebirth of our hearts and minds. Yes.
I'm just curious, how does that word relate to metanoia?
Ah, good. Metanoia. Somebody knows some Greek here. This is really helpful. Metanoia. This is also a compound word. Meta means after. Noia is the mental process. So if you have afterthoughts, second thoughts, regrets, right? So this word gets translated as what? Repentance. Right? You have second thoughts, you think afterwards about what you've done, and you decide to reform. The root here in both cases relates to the mind, what the mind does. So these are two different words. Anakinosis is the more rare word. It's the enkindling of a new attitude, a new frame of mind. And boy, this is what we need. As a graduate of Yale Divinity School, I recently received an announcement that an institute has been created there in the Divinity School for social renewal, continuing the work of the civil rights movement. And the person appointed to lead it is a man named William Barber. Have you heard him speak? From North Carolina, William Barber from North Carolina. Yeah, he's quite, he's continuing, devoting himself to Christian efforts to help the poor. And in a speech that he gave at Yale the other day, this was the word that he picked up from Paul. That we can't do without this. That's what we need. We need a renewal of our minds, a renewal of our hearts. So Paul says we need this. This is what transformation depends upon. It depends upon a new way of thinking, a renewal of our minds. And in that way, we will be able, Paul says, to discern the will of God. Now, that's tricky, isn't it? What is God's will in any particular situation? Right? As we struggle with the partisan divide here in this country, as we struggle with ethnic violence all around the world, what is the will of God? Well, Paul gives us some clues in the words that follow. He says, here are your clues. This is what you're looking for. You're looking for what is what? Good. And what else? Acceptable to God and perfect. Thank you, Cindy. Those are the clues. If you're trying to figure out in any given situation, what does God will? It will be good. It will be acceptable to God. God will welcome it. And in fact, it will be complete. That's what the word perfect means. It means nothing will be missing. You will exhaust your sacrifice in giving it. Now, in the next paragraph, Paul focuses on what each of us has been given. The gift. We have received gifts. Sometimes we are reluctant to admit it, but Paul insists that we must acknowledge the gifts that we've been given, but these gifts have to be received in soberness. We can't become inflated. The exercise of our gift is limited by the gift given to another. So look at the next paragraph. For by the grace given to me, Paul himself acknowledges that he has received a gift from God, and it is only by means of that, what he's been given, that he is able to say to everyone among you not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with soberness, with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Now, twice in the verse that I just read, Paul uses the little word hekastos. Hekastos means each. Each and every one of us has been given a gift. It is a measure. The Greek word is metron. Metron pisteos. It is a measure of faith. God has measured out to each one of us who have heard the calling of the message of the loving and self-giving Jesus, God has measured out a certain amount of faith to us. Yeah, and it is to each. It's to each. In other words, God does not give a single individual all of the grace. Too often I hear about churches where a single individual, right, believes that he is the master and everyone must follow him. He's been given all of the grace. He defines the measure of faith. No, Paul says, hekastos, each. Each person in a Christ community has been given a measure of faith. God has assigned it. And if you recognize that, you can be sober about it. You won't become inflated with your own importance. You won't try to encroach upon another person's gift, but you'll gratefully acknowledge it. And now Paul picks up one of the oldest metaphors for life in community. It's an explicitly political metaphor. It's the body metaphor, the body politic. We still use that metaphor today, don't we? So our community, our politeia, our state is like a body. This metaphor has a long history in Greece and Rome. It appears for the first time, does anyone know? In the fable of Menenius Agrippa. So glad my mother didn't name me Menenius. Menenius Agrippa. So here's what happened. In the history of the Roman Republic, the ordinary people, the workers, the plebs, voted to have a general strike. They withdrew from the city of Rome. They camped on the field of Mars, and they refused to work for the patricians, for the 3% that owned the property and controlled the wealth. I don't know how long the strike went on, but eventually the patricians designated one of their own, a man named Menenius Agrippa, to go out there to the plebeian camp, out there to the striking workers, and persuade them to come back, to get back to work, get back to producing children and producing crops. And he told them what is described as a fable. Now, fables, then and now, are used with whom? Children, thank you, exactly. In other words, Menenius Agrippa, the proud aristocrat, infantilized the ordinary people. He told them a fable. He said, now, the city of Rome, the state of Rome, is like a human body. We patricians are the head and the stomach. You plebes are the hands, the feet, and the genitalia. And we have to each perform our own role. And only if we do that will Rome survive. See, the patricians are the head and the stomach that has to be fed by the hands and feet. It's a rigorously hierarchical conception of the body. Well, I don't know if it was that fable that persuaded the plebs to come back. I think it was probably the concession that the patricians made to the appointment of 10 tribunes of the plebs, who had the power of what? Veto over decrees and laws passed by the Senate, the club of rich men. I've argued, and Diane has also argued, that these 10 tribunes of the plebs, the advocates of the people, were the earliest ombudsmen. I think that's right. But they did. They had that power to veto laws. Now, eventually, the patricians found a way to take the power back. What they did was that a certain number of patricians resigned their status and had themselves redesignated as plebs. And they ran for the office of tribune and got it. And then the whole system was corrupted. But the reason I've spent some time telling you the fable of Menenius Agrippa is that I want you to see what Paul does with the body metaphor. How Paul insists that it is not hierarchical at all. Paul says, for as in one body we have what? Many members. And notice he doesn't distinguish between the head and the stomach, the hands and the feet. We have many members, and not all the members have the same function. They're all different. Each has its own. So we, who are many, are one body in Christ. Wow. We remain, according to Paul, the many. We are hoi polloi. We are the many. In other words, our differences are not eradicated. That's Paul's conception of community. We retain our differences. Our uniqueness, our eachness is not erased. We're not all homogenized. We remain the many. So then how is this many going to be one body? Now, I insist, Larry, upon translating the Greek here literally. And if you do, here's what it says. We, the many, are one body. The Greek says literally, on account of one. On account of one. Our unity consists in our participation in the one who did what? Died for all. Gave his life for everybody, including the weak and the sinful. The possibility that we might be unified is given in that one. Insofar as we share his self-sacrificial love, extending God's mercies in the world instead of vengeance, then we can be part of one body. So I don't like the translation that's offered here in the Revised Standard Version that says individually we are members of one another. That's not what the Greek says. What it says is on account of one. See, they translate this individually, as if it depends upon us, right? Individually, we get into the one body. That's not what the Greek says. The Greek says on account of one, we can be a body in Christ. And that one, for Paul, is the one who died for others, for all. We have gifts, Paul says, that differ according to the grace given to us. Prophecy, that's the first gift that he lists. Prophecy in proportion to what? Faith. So prophecy has a limit. It is limited by the faith that a person has been given. It is harnessed to trust. It's regulated by trust in God. When I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, Pete, a long time ago, there was a group there that invited Diane and I to dinner. And they had a person who believed that he had the gift of promise. And he uttered his prophecy in glossolalia. In other words, he was speaking in what? Tongues. And he claimed that he knew the future and he could tell people in the group what they ought to do on that basis. We had dinner with this group and we heard him speak in tongues. And afterwards, a member of the group came up to me and said, "What did you think of that?" expecting that I would be really impressed and overwhelmed. And I said, well, actually, I understood a good bit of what your prophet said. He repeatedly said, Elohi, Elohi, lama sabachthani, which means what? My God, why have you forsaken me? Oh, I'll never forget that experience, right? No, his prophecy was not limited by his faith. So Paul says, if you have the gift of prophecy, it can only be properly lived out according to and in proportion to faith. Look at the next one, ministry. It's not your possession, Paul says. The gift of ministry is realized in ministry. It's not a status. It's not a status. In our own time, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, understood this. And in his letters and papers, Larry, from prison, he sought to radicalize the idea of the priesthood of all believers. And he said that, maybe in the face of the terrible evil of fascism, Hitler, people who have been ordained, who hold the office of minister, maybe they should give it up so that every Christian can be involved in ministry. He said pastors ought not to take any more money or live in a parsonage. These were his radical last thoughts. But the point is this: ministry, that gift, is not a status, according to Paul. It exists only insofar as a person lives out the gift. Ministry in ministering. The teacher in teaching. So when the people in the Bronx, my Italian neighbors, when they see me come in the door and they want me to buy an expensive cheese, and they begin they initiate the transaction by addressing me as what? Professore, right? No. Insofar as I am a teacher, it's not a status. It is only in teaching. It's in the living out of the gift it's not a status. The exhorter in exhortation. The giver in generosity. So no more, according to Paul, no more benefactors, who were honored and glorified in Greek and Roman cities because they donated a building to the city. No, it's not a status. It is the living out of a gift. A giver is such only in the act of giving. The leader, look at this one. The leader in diligence. Wow. The compassionate, I love this one. If you've been given the gift of compassion, how is it realized? Look what he says. In cheerfulness. Wow. In cheerfulness. Diane established with a couple of her friends a soup kitchen in New Haven, Connecticut, a long time ago. And people would come because of compassion. But what Diane tried to get them to understand is that sharing good cheerfulness, it was the way to realize their compassion, not sitting there brokenhearted, feeling sorry for people. In fact, Diane took it so far when she saw a person that came full of compassion, but not yet able to be cheerful, she would say to them, okay, today you don't serve the soup or hand out the bread. You sit at the table with the people who have come to eat and laugh and be cheerful. Compassion in cheerfulness. Isn't that amazing? There's a reason why Paul is sometimes regarded as the second founder of Christianity. He is just a spiritual, he's so profound in thinking through all these things. Larry.
Before you move on to that next paragraph.
Yes.
Oftentimes it's just said, well, people need to read the Bible. This is hard to get what you are, they need to read the Bible with you.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have ever thought about producing a text that's readable for people that incorporates this kind of accuracy, but you don't get it when you stick to a word-by-word
Right.
translation. And I wonder if you know personally Eugene Peterson, you're a Presbyterian, he is.
I know, yes,
I think he just died.
yes, that's right,
I wanted to read what you just,
yeah,
out of the message
right,
and see what you think about this.
yeah, that's.
Because you lose something, but
Right,
maybe also gain something. Here's what he said. In this way, we are like the various parts of a human body. Each part gets its meaning from the body as a whole, not the other way around.
Yeah.
The body we're talking about is Christ's body
right,
of chosen people.
good for him, good for him.
Each of us finds our meaning and function as a part of his body. But as a chopped off finger or a cut off toe, we wouldn't amount to much, would we? So since we find ourselves fashioned into all these excellently formed and marvelously functioning parts in Christ's body, let's just go ahead and be what we were made to be, without enviously or pridefully comparing ourselves with each other, or just trying to be something that we are not. If you preach, just preach God's message, nothing else. If you help, just help, don't take over. If you teach, stick to your teaching. If you give encouraging guidance, be careful you don't get bossy. And this is, it's kind of charming in a way,
Yeah.
cut off finger and so
Yeah.
on, but he goes
He's
beyond the.
Yeah, he's got it.
If you're put in charge, don't manipulate. If you're called to give aid to people in distress, keep your eyes open and be quick to respond. If you work with a disadvantage, don't let yourself get irritated with them or depressed.
Cheerful.
Keep a smile on your face.
Right.
That's the end of that paragraph.
He's got it, he's got it.
Do you think that's?
He's got it.
is
Now,
that worth
thank you.
doing?
Oh,
Or-
absolutely, Larry. Thank you for encouraging me. You know, I have set, and I'll just tell you all this secret. I have set the fall of 2025 as my retirement date.
Yeah.
That's coming up, right? And you have just given me something to do. Yeah, you've given me, instead of viewing the fall of 2025 as the end of something, you've just encouraged me to make it the beginning of something. So I'll aim then to make a new version of the message. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. It's only people who have accepted the fact that if they really want to understand what Paul's language, his message means and meant, you have to spend years learning Greek.
Yeah.
And you have to learn the culture, the cultural context, right? No escape from it. I'll tell you when I finally accepted it and it came home to me. I was a good college student, graduated at the top of my class. Graduated at the top of my class at Yale Divinity School. And when I went to Tübingen, I thought I was something, right? And I discovered that every student preparing for the humblest country pastorate knew more Greek than I did in Germany. And so during the 2 years that Diane and I were students there, instead of going to all these high-flown theological lectures, by Hans Küng and Peter Stuhlmacher and the other famous ones, guess what I did? I went back into the Greek classroom. Yeah. I realized it had to happen. Otherwise, I could never bring Paul's message to life.
But so often then that would just limit you to the interpretation of a particular word.
Yeah.
Rather than the expansion of it into metaphors of our language that then speak to us.
That's right.
And I think if you will do that.
Well, you've given me a retirement.
In the
Yeah.
English world, are going to be really pleased.
Yeah, you've opened, Really, you've given me quite a gift here, holding out a future
Don't
for me.
expect any money, but
Oh, thank you. That's, of all the gifts you've given me down through the years, that'd be the best one. Paul continues in the next paragraph. Let love be genuine. And the Greek word that he uses here, you all can translate it, anhypokrites, not hypocritical. And what you need to know is that the Greek word hypokrites is actually the technical term for what? Does anyone know?
it's a mask. or
An
something.
yes, an actor, a person who puts on a mask and acts a part, a role. So love can't be a put on. It can't be a facade. It has to be genuine and authentic. That's Paul's first principle there. Let love be unhypocritical, not just an act. Hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. The Greek word here that's translated mutual affection is philostorges. Can you say that with me? Philostorges. So you can see the first part of it means love, right? Storges is a feeling that comes from down deep inside a person. And in terms of how the word is used, it is most frequently used for the deep bond that one feels in the family, right? What you feel for your mother, your father, your children, your beloved aunt. That's philostorgia, right? So Paul says the kind of mutual affection that should exist in the Christian community is like what you feel when you get together with your family members. Jim, when you and Joan go up to Maine, right, to see her father, when our son comes home from California for Christmas, and it's almost the love that we feel, the emotion is almost too deep for words. That, Paul says, is what ought to be there in Christian community. Outdo one another in showing honor to other people, not seeking honor, but showing it. Do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering. Boy, I need that one. I need that one. You hear who's laughing, don't you? Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. And now at the end of this, so far, Paul's been talking about the way of life, the ethic that should prevail within Christian community. But here, just at the end, Paul turns a corner. He says, look at it, extend hospitality, xenia, to strangers. Uh-oh. Now he's going to look outside the Christian community. And at this terrible moment in our own history, so full of mutual hatred and vengeance against one another, in our own country, partisan hatred. We can't even get a Speaker of the House, right? Because of deep divides and partisanship. Look what Paul says. Bless those who persecute you. Now, of course, here, as a few scholars have recognized, Paul doesn't often quote the sayings of Jesus, and he doesn't stop here and say, as Jesus said, bless those who persecute you. But this is an echo of the Jesus tradition in the Sermon on the Mount. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Boy, that is so contrary. Don't be conformed to this world, Paul says. Be transformed by a renewal of your minds, so that you're not going on like people in the world do, cursing those who persecute you. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. This is part of that philostorgia, right? When we were in California visiting our son, at one moment, our son felt like he wasn't realizing his own goals in life. And as we sat on the front porch of the little shack that we rented, it was really a shack, outdoor plumbing. But as we sat there on the porch and the sunlight filtered down through the trees, our son began to feel like he had not met the goals he had set for himself in his life, and he began to weep. It's a hard thing to watch a 32, 33-year-old boy weep. And I wept with him and told him what one of my mentors said to me. Yeah, this kind of thing that happens in our family, right? Paul believes that can happen in Christian community and beyond it. Weep with those who weep. I was part of an unforgettable conversation at United Seminary some years ago. United Seminary was trying to become more inclusive, trying to move beyond the color line, right? Trying to incorporate more African American, more Asian people. And so we had a retreat, a faculty retreat out in the country somewhere here. And the turning point in that retreat was when one of my African American colleagues, a lovely woman who taught pastoral psychology, she looked around at the mostly white group of her colleagues, and she said, the reason that we have not made progress so far, that we have not moved further down the road toward a beloved community, is that we have not wept together. We have not wept together. Weep with those who weep, Paul says. So profound. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty. Wow. I read online a diagnosis of why we can't find a speaker of the House, and the person said it's because every one of those, how many people in the Congress believes that they are one. Yeah, that they ought to be speaker. Paul says it won't work that way. Don't be haughty, but rather associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Boy, we need that word right now, right? If a person or a state is attacked, what do? They repay it. They repay evil for evil. Paul says, no, that there's no life in a community that operates in that way. Don't repay anyone evil for evil.
That is more or less equal. So if somebody does something to you,
right,
you do the same thing to them.
Right.
Like an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But at the moment, it feels like you take out 1,200 of our people. Right. We've already taken out 4,000 of theirs.
Right.
And it's beyond the Old Testament eye for an eye.
It's beyond.
Which was to control.
Right.
And then Jesus said, you heard an eye for an eye. No, I say, no.
Love your enemy. Right.
So,
Larry, this week I Googled, because it was haunting me all week long. I Googled who said an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. You know who it was? It was Mohandas K. Gandhi.
Oh.
And in his autobiography, has anyone read his autobiography? It's so beautiful. It's not a long book. It's called An Account of My Experiments with the Truth. Isn't that a great title? Back in the days when my vision was better, I read the whole thing driving down the road from Vanderbilt back up to Ohio. And guess what he says, Larry? He says when he got to London, when he got to England, as a barrister. He was looking for some place that he could eat vegetarian food because he was a Hindu. And guess what group he found? He found a group of Christian vegetarians. And they gave him, first time in his life, a copy of the Sermon on the Mount. And in his autobiography, Gandhi says, insofar as Christianity is defined by the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, I am a Christian. Isn't that wonderful? And he was the one who said, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. And of course, Martin King, who went to India and was inspired by Gandhi, he picked it up from Gandhi. Jesus, Gandhi, King. Yeah, don't repay evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And now look at the next verse. Look at the next verse. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemy, so not just a poor person, your enemy, if your enemies are what? Hungry, do what? Feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. Robert Jewett, my wonderful old friend who died not long ago and who wrote the largest commentary on Romans ever written for the famous Hermeneus series, 1,200 pages. He admitted to me it took him 30 years and 3 marriages. When he gets to this point in the text, do you know what he says? He says, when Paul says, if your enemies hunger, feed them, and if they are thirsty, give them something to drink. Jewett argues that Paul is encouraging the Roman Christians to invite their enemies at Rome, people that don't like them, that are reporting them to the police, invite them to what? The Lord's Supper, to the agape feast. Jewett did a lot of research on tenement churches in early Christianity, collaborating with his Heidelberg colleague, Peter Laffa, who investigated early tenement churches in Rome. And so Jewett argued that when Paul says, if your enemy hungers, feed him, if he or she thirsts, give him something to drink, Jewett argued Paul was encouraging the Roman Christians, to invite their enemies to come to the agape feast, to come into the courtyard of an apartment building and learn what it means to be welcomed, to be given hospitality as a Christian. And Paul concludes this, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with what? Good. This is not peace through victory. It's peace through what? Goodness. Through the oiktirmoi, the mercies of God. That's the only road to peace. Now, I know that I'm probably reaching
You got 1 minute.
1 minute. And in that 1 minute, can I direct your attention to chapter 14 in Romans? When you get back home today, please read chapter 14, because now Paul says to the Jews, Jewish Christians on the one hand, and to the Gentile Christians on the other, he says, you should welcome one another without conditions. Without conditions. He says at the beginning, welcome those who are weak in faith. You think the other person is weak? Welcome them, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Don't welcome them just so you can what? Argue them over to your side. No, we remain the many with our differences. And if we can be one, it's only insofar as we participate in the self-sacrificial love of the one. And at the end of all this, in chapter 15, verse 7, Paul says, welcome one another, therefore, how? Welcome one another just as Christ, what? Welcomed you for the glory of God. How did Christ welcome us? Did Christ require that we meet some standard, right? That we achieve some goal? No, it was while we were what? Sinners and weak. Welcome one another just as Christ welcomed you. That's welcome without conditions, right? Radical hospitality. That Paul says that is the only way to be a community of reconciliation. Well, it's an incredible vision in Romans, isn't it, Dee? I'm glad you suggested it, that we explore it. It's still, I think, the most visionary writing, and also in terms of exhortation, practical exhortation. It is so profound and wonderful, so countercultural right now. Yes.
I find one thing in there very, very astonishing to me. We talk about you're supposed to be faithful, you're supposed to be honorable, all these things that you're asked sometimes, well, which one are you? We're all of them. We're all of them. And whatever you need at the time to support your brother or sister, family, that is me. And I find that an amazing revelation to me this morning, because instead of being, one, you're all right.
That's right. To each, right? To each is given the measure that they need. Thank you all so much. I have to go back to New York tomorrow, but I'll be back here whenever you want me. Thank you all so much.
We were talking about the living sacrifice.
Yes.